My name is Nim, and I'm on the wrong screen. There we go. You are here for mutual aid and anti-oppression. If that's not what you thought you were here for, then feel free to excuse yourselves. But we're going to be here for the next 90 minutes or so, talking through what this means. How we're going to do that, what the agenda looks like, is first of all, I'm going to talk a bit about framing what it is I think that we're dealing with and we're talking about. Then we'll move on to understanding mutual aid and anti-oppression principles, a bit of a theoretical grounding. Then we'll look at some top tips for longer term change work in practice, and then we'll have time for a Q&A. If at any time throughout this you have questions, please pop them in the chat box, and we will keep an eye on them, and I'll pause at moments and check in to see what questions there are. You'll see Gary's on the call. Thanks for waving. We'll be checking the chat box for me because I can't track the chat box and the videos and the slides at the same time. So if I don't answer immediately to questions, don't worry, we will come back to it. So who am I and why am I running this? What I forgot to put on this slide is that I am a Neon Associate and Senior Trainer. I also have around 15 years of experience in activism and organising in the UK and across Europe. I'm a cross-movement trainer and facilitator, by which I mean that I train and facilitate in spaces across different movements, bringing different parts of movements together, and intentionally working with groups with who face different and multiple oppressions together in the same room. I'm trans, I'm a person of colour, I'm disabled, and so this is really live for me. It's real and real work, and really I came to this work from starting out in the climate movement, and because of who I am, being a bit like, what is happening here? I don't understand this space, and starting to run trainings and facilitate around that about 15 years ago. At this point in my life, I'm also a consultant around anti-oppression, so I work with lots of groups, from grassroots groups up to big international campaign organisations and NGOs around strategic development, organisational development, and anti-oppression and equity. And finally, I'm also part of the COVID Mutual Aid UK team, specifically a part of the team focused on supporting anti-oppression approaches in mutual aid at this moment in time. So that is a little bit of context for those of you. I can see some familiar faces on this call, but for those of you who don't know me, it's a little bit about me and why I'm doing this work, or this evening. So this slide, don't worry, it's intentionally overwhelming. You don't need to read it. It's here to say that you all filled in a question in your applications for this, telling us what it was that you wanted. This is a handful of the answers. This is by no means all the answers. And I just wanted to flag that there are a lot of different requests, different desires from this training, and different starting points in this conversation. So I've tried to create a session that responds to as many and as much of that as I can. And just to say that in 90 minutes, I'm probably not going to cover all of it in the detail that you desperately want and need, but hopefully we'll get to some grounding of all of it. And like I said, there'll be time for questions and answers where you can ask me more applied, and each other more applied questions about what this means in practice. Okay, so what's the problem? I think we're probably all on the same page about this, but first of all, this thing has happened that has taken us all into a very new world. We're all experiencing it very differently. Everybody's living very different lives right now, even though we're sharing a very similar experience. And initially what we saw is a lot of rhetoric around fear, around competition, division, and very quickly mutual aid networks were set up, trying to build some infrastructure for us to take care of each other. Some things that we know that are happening nationally are that BAME people are dying more. Migrants with insecure status are scared, so a lot of undocumented migrants are dying because of fear of engaging with services. There is significant mental health impacts, and coronavirus and it's spread, or COVID and it's spread through mental health hospitals, isn't being reported on very effectively right now. Sex workers are also falling through the cracks among with more acute oppressions in addition to kind of other precarious workers. So this is just a highlight or lowlights rather of some of the ways that we know that this is affecting specific groups differently, that people are trying to make central to this conversation. So something that I'm doing with the National Mutual Aid Group, like I said, is working to address anti-oppression in how groups are organising. We've got a survey out at the moment for people engaged in mutual aid work to ask them about their experiences so that we can work out what the actual need is on the ground as opposed to what our assumptions are, particularly because most of us are based in London in our 30s or thereabouts and from very specific political backgrounds. Some of the biggest barriers to doing this work is that a lot of the groups are spread all over the country with different cultural, demographic, geographic, and political makeups. And that was also true of the people who applied for this webinar in a very micro sense. Another barrier is how people are facing mutual aid work. So some people are using or focusing their mutual aid work on need. So they're organising around food essentials and medication and making sure those things are available. Some people are doing it through focusing on specific groups. So a lot of people talk about focusing on trying to reach elderly or shielding groups. And some are just focused on doing something. So we just want to help. And that's quite significant in terms of how we have this conversation, because what people think they're doing is quite different from the outset, both within the same groups and in different groups. The next thing is, one of the questions that we ask people is, have incidences of prejudice or discrimination arisen? And a lot of people answer that question no. And it's very hard for us to know if that's because that's true, or if that's because they don't know, or they feel scared about saying yes. So really dealing with what's going on is hard because of that barrier. And finally, all of this work being moved to a virtual landscape is new and challenging and leaving people behind. And it's something that everybody, or many of us, I should say, are trying very hard to adapt to learn, and to cross bridges that we've never crossed before very quickly. So there's kind of fear, there's chaos, there's different aims. And this is all creating this weird and wonderful world that we find ourselves in trying to talk about mutual aid and anti-oppression. Finally, this is just the context, and then I'll move on to some more content. Some of the problems that are being identified by mutual aid groups around anti-O work is the groups tend to be made up of similar demographics of people. So people know and are identifying that they're not reaching different people in their communities. Tech-based methods are excluding those most in need. So who has data and Wi-Fi, who has smartphones with WhatsApp, and who doesn't. We'll talk more about these in more detail as we go through this session, but these are just the headline summaries right now. Text-based communication is allowing little room for trust and understanding, so it's much harder for us to lean into conversations carefully and articulately when we're having to do it through text. People are really struggling with how to manage unconscious bias or ignorance as it's showing up, so whether that's comments on Facebook posts or in the WhatsApp group, etc. Policing is a significant issue, and different relationships to the police and people's instincts to call the police in certain situations, alongside an awareness of many of us that the police have a very different response to different communities, so trans communities, Black communities, other people of colour communities, and so on, working class communities. And then the biggest barrier that everybody seems to be facing is just not knowing what the hell to do about any of it. And that's really the shared problem of everybody. So that's some framing for us and context for what is going on right now at the national level. So I'm going to take a quick pause and just check whether there are any questions or anything to share at that point. Great. Okay. So I'm going to now go quite a few of the requests of people submitting in advance of this workshop was for some kind of basic understanding of what we really mean by mutual aid and anti-oppression. So I'm going to have a little section talking a bit about that. So the first thing is mutual aid and what it is. Essentially, like I could run, I'm not going to, but we could run a kind of like 90-minute Marxist fuckboy analysis of what mutual aid is and all the theories and principles behind it, but I'm not going to do that because I don't want to bore you or me. There's lots and lots and lots of theory. People like to really geek out on structures like mutual aid. It's an important practice that has existed for many, many decades of building community and interdependence. Oops. There we go. It's founded on community and interdependence, and they're often the kind of main qualities that get spoken about when we talk about mutual aid. So building networks of people with shared resources and shared interests and creating interdependence in the sharing of those things. What gets talked about a bit less frequently is trust and the relationship to trust that has. That in process that builds trust, but in order for those things to exist, you also need trust. So we've got this reciprocal relationship in mutual aid that moves between building community and interdependence and also trust, and ensuring that they're constantly kind of in relationship and in balance with each other. What they don't do, however, inherently, is have an analysis of power. So mutual aid is about a collectivized power rather than an intra-community power relation. So it sees power through the strength of us collectivizing our resources and becoming interdependent and separate from needing the state or charity or other structures. It doesn't talk about power dynamics within the group, or it rarely does, I should say, in its purest form. So that's a very quick summary of mutual aid. Anti-oppression, I'm curious to think, right in the chat box, what do you think anti-oppression is? Here we've got ensuring equity, actively working to expose inequalities. Somebody says conscious and active work to overcome societal bias and inequality. Working to understand oppression in all its forms, repair harms done, and work towards achieving liberation. Anti-oppression is fighting interconnected systems of oppression, fighting for justice and equity, actively working to ensure inequalities are highlighted and overcome for liberation, dismantling predatory power. I'd probably have used the phrase collective liberation in the context of mutual aid. Countering or undoing practices which create inequality and injustice, active steps taken to counteract oppression that exists within the structure of society and also within our minds and behaviours. Yeah, so it sounds like of all the people who applied to come on this webinar this evening, the people with significant knowledge bases are the people who joined. Collective liberation is what comes from anti-oppression. Yeah, great. Exactly, I think, as you are all alluding to or saying, ultimately, it's actively working to minimize oppression. It's not an identity or a destination, it's ongoing practice, it's dialogue, and it's work. We don't get to anti-oppression, we do anti-oppression. And I think there's this phrase that gets turned around in anti-racist circles of you can't be not racist. You can only be racist or anti-racist. So it's the moving from, it's not a neutral, you can't be neutral in the face of oppression. It's about being active and engaged. However, in reality, in material experience, what that often manifests as in online spaces, or the ways that people relate to it in terms of behavior and practice, is calling out, which is a really useful tactic. The biggest pro being that it intervenes and immediately harm and serves red lines of accountability. So it highlights when harm is being done. However, it can often be used by allies to serve their sense of good and doesn't necessarily consider the long-term or safety aspect for the people being harmed. So when we get into a practice of a behavior of how we do something or how we want to be seen to doing something, the action can become at odds with the intention, which is something that many of us will have heard and know about when we're talking about things like racism. But this also happens in the how we address things, not just in the what we're addressing. Which doesn't mean to say that calling out never has a place. It can be really important at times. I'm actually going to move on a couple of slides very quickly and then come back to, because I think I've got a meme or a quote which expresses this well, which is something that I think you're all expressing, that Maya Angelou said, is, I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And that's really at the heart of what a lot of you are speaking about in that moment of being told off or told that you're wrong. Kat, I'm really feeling you right now. Yeah, it's a really powerful quote. So what I want to talk about is reframing calling out as a tactic as opposed to a strategy, which is one of the blocks that we often get to when we are facing somebody saying something in a group that is discriminatory or prejudiced. And often the only thing we know to go to is calling out, because it's the common cultural practice. But being strategic in these moments is balancing safety of people being harmed, balancing the trust, which is true of a group that we want to keep working with, like mutual aid groups that we're setting up, and balancing the growth, so the potential for us all to learn and to move forward and heal. This is, I'm just going to name, as all binaries are, it's a false binary. So I just want to name that before everybody starts jumping in and saying, don't be so reductive. It's definitely a false binary. But these tactics all have their place and have their moments. And in a very simplified way, we might think about calling out in terms of it and intervening in the immediate harm. So some of you in what worked said, it stopped me doing that thing, or I learned very quickly. But it also breaks trust. It can create fear and defensiveness, both for the person being told off, but also for other people around, even people being harmed by the thing that's being told off. Because when you create a culture of calling out, people get fearful to speak, which is what some of you talked about. Breaking trust can sometimes be good if the trust that has been built is built on harmful views and behaviors. But it also means that you have to do a lot more work to rebuild. And so calculating that holding that in your calculations of when that's a useful strategy is important. And sometimes it's used by allies to make themselves feel better. None of you, I don't think, talked explicitly about power in what was bad about being told off, but it often is very disempowering, and it can be used by somebody to make themselves feel more powerful in a situation. With calling out, I think it's not necessarily explicitly like it would be with a teacher about somebody feeling powerful, but I think many people will probably resonate with experiences of calling out being used for example, one white person wanting to feel better about their righteousness than other white people. On the other hand, slowing down to think about long-term education, I'll explain more what I mean by that soon, don't worry, can focus on long-term change rather than the immediate situation. So you can actually think about how you move somebody's behavior and understanding in a more compassionate and deeper way. It therefore builds trust and enables you to push further by taking it slower. Sometimes, though, it is also used by allies to hide behind confrontation. And so neither of these two things, just to be clear, am I suggesting that one is implicitly good and the other is implicitly bad. There are different tactics to apply in different situations based on what you're trying to achieve. And slowing down and thinking about that is really the first step in groups of moving forward. Something to say is, I said this is a false binary. That's true for many reasons, including the fact that there are many different actions that you could take in between these. This is just an example of the different ends of the spectrum. So what we often need is allies doing long-term education work. And the reason that often doesn't happen is it's harder work and it's often unseen and unnoticed. And what I mean by that is, just realized the slide I thought I had next is not for another couple of slides. But what I mean by that is engaging somebody where they are to understand why they are saying and believe the things that they do. Working with them to move them from their comfort zone into discomfort slowly over time. But what that process takes is trust. And what that process builds is trust. What it doesn't always do is say, in this moment, it's not okay to say that because it is harming people. Which is why I asked you to talk about what were the positives of being told that something was wrong in the moment, as well as the negatives. Does that make sense to people? Great. And that's, sorry, so coming back to the quote, I skipped on it because I showed it to you already, but coming back to the quote, the point being that most of us learn through feeling. We learn through being in an environment, and many of those experiences that you will think about, you'll think back to that were formative, as Maya says, is how you felt, how something made you feel. We don't tend to learn through shame, which is a word that a lot of you used. It can be a powerful tool to stop us doing things, but it's not within the qualities of the groups and the cultures and the outcomes that we want to achieve. And so that's why we need to be careful with thinking about how we use it. So coming back to this, mutual aid plus anti-oppression is community and interdependence, and its mutual relationship with trust, but also its mutual relationship with power. So it's about us weaving and understanding power through the qualities of community and interdependence and trust that we're trying to achieve in our mutual aid practice. Some top tips for integrating anti-O into longer term change work. This includes power within, thank you, Mira. Working with who is in your group, working with who isn't in your group, and political versus apolitical organising, which is a juxtaposition that came up in some of the comments that people put in their applications to this webinar. So I'll explain what I mean by that when we get there. What I'm going to do first is talk about what anti-oppression and mutual aid or organising looks like in real life organising in this section. And then I'm going to move into the next section to talking about what that means in the COVID era world of virtual and distance organising. So starting with working with who is in your group. So a lot of the time, the reason I separated these out is a lot of the time when we try to think about these things, it feels really overwhelming because we bounce between who's here and what work am I doing with who's here, and who's not here and what work am I doing to bring other people in. And we're kind of in a constant state of flux of bouncing between these two things, which means we're not thinking about either strategically, and we start using the same approaches for both. And that's where we start to fall down. So that's why I've separated them out like this. So the first one, which is what we've started talking about already, is meet people where they are. When we're talking about mutual aid groups, another difference we're all talking about is that for some of us, we're talking about groups that have existed already for a long time, or that we hope to continue in some way for a long time. And for some of us, we approach them as a temporary structure in this moment. And so I should have said this in the last slide, actually, when we were talking about the equation of trust, which is that you also have to make decisions of trust based on how long you're going to be in relationship with these people for. So what do you want to achieve? What can you hope for in that relationship? And that's a variable for each of you that will be different. So I should have just named that in the last slide. So meet people where they are. Who has ever had somebody to try and explain something to you and they're starting in such advanced language that you have no idea what they're talking about? How does it make you feel? Stupid. Yeah. Easiest answer. You're like, I don't know what you're talking about. Confused, you switch off, you feel small, it's disempowering. Exactly. A lot of the time, inadequate. A lot of the time in this work, what happens is we start talking to people with language, with concepts, with ideas that are so far out of their frame of reference that it doesn't make sense. And what we end up doing is making people feel bad. Making people feel bad, as we've already talked about, isn't how people learn. So we need to find their comfort and then move them to discomfort. So that doesn't mean where are you uncomfortable, it means where are they uncomfortable. I'll do that in a moment. So in learning, we have this idea of comfort zones and learning zones. And so in your comfort zone, it's when you're doing things that are comfortable to you, that you know, that are familiar. In this current era, for me, it's sitting on my sofa and watching about 1,000 Netflix shows in 2 weeks. It's the things that are familiar, that are comfortable, that are known. And when you start moving into your discomfort zone, it's uncomfortable explicitly because you have new ideas, new concepts, new people, new opportunities coming into your world. And that is inherently uncomfortable. Newness is uncomfortable. If you move too far out of that too quickly, you get into your panic or danger zone when you're overloaded with information and it's too much. Your brain, you can't hold it. And all you want to do when you're there is jump us back to comfort as quickly as possible. The sweet spot is finding the edge just outside of comfort. So we're not talking like deep, deep discomfort. We're talking uncomfortable. Like, I should have worn a jumper and I'm only wearing a shirt. That level of discomfort. And you hold somebody there. And the thing about this is that when somebody stands in that discomfort long enough, it becomes comfortable. And that allows you to stretch the comfort zone a bit more. That is the foundational principle of learning, of any learning, of anything, from baby's development through to adult learning. So that's really what a principle to hold on to when you're working with groups and trying to understand, how do I move this group or this person forward? So what we also need to be doing in our groups is actively building trust and independency. Sometimes there's this assumption that just by being in a group together, we will do that. That's true, it can happen, but normally it's a kind of like happy consequence. It's not inherent. How many of you have been in groups where you have very quickly dissolved into distrust and not wanting to be in the same room as each other? Yeah. So if you don't pay attention to this, it could just as easily go either way. Actively do things to build trust and independency. I thought that the next point talked to that. I'll come back to that point. I've got some, I'll come back to that point later in practical ways to do that in mutual aid groups. Reiterate the principle to somebody. You don't have to understand why someone is hurt to want to not hurt them. You don't have to understand why someone is hurt to want to not hurt them. So as a trainer, I work in lots of different spaces with lots of different people regularly, and I work with different teams. As a trans person, it means that sometimes I also work with people who don't understand trans people or trans identity, who have questions about it. And one of the primary things I say to them is, we can have these conversations, you can keep questioning, but in the space that we're going into right now, you need to know that safety is what's most important in that space. And that's not the space for those questions. And that conversation is normally the most transformative conversation that you can have with somebody, because the sudden switching out of I'm trying to logic my way or rationalize my way or understand my way through this issue into, oh, I don't want to hurt somebody, which doesn't mean I can't ask questions. It just means I need to think about where and how I'm asking questions, is quite a transformational process for somebody to go through. So community independence and trust, aka mutual aid, help people be invested in learning. So actually by building those things, people want to learn together in a space together. And by learning, I don't mean like formal education. I mean, we want to learn and grow together. And learning together about our life experience also helps build community, independence, and trust. So we see another nice symbiotic relationship if we can pay attention to all parts of the cycle. And this is really important. Recognizing we're all learning, including you, even if you know more than others, is really, really foundational to anti-oppressive work. Your learning in a moment might be supporting other people in their understanding. You might literally know more, but there's still things to learn. And positioning yourself as intellectually or morally superior won't help your growth or theirs. It's also a form of oppression. And so challenging that idea in oppression work is inherent to the work. So this is just an image of learning zones, to reiterate the point. Okay, so finally, remember, in organising, in building communities and groups, there is no perfect process. Process is important because it helps people understand how and why we're doing things, which is an important way for it to be accessible for people, but there is no perfect process. There is also no perfect process for working through anti-oppression. So you can put loads of work into supporting somebody and they still could respond from defensiveness or for trauma at any points in these conversations, even when you think you've got enough trust to lean into a difficult conversation with somebody. This work at its heart is about working through the messiness, not trying to create sanitized and conflict averse groups. At its heart, it's working through messiness. We are messy people. I'm sorry if nobody's ever told you that in your life, but we are messy people. We know none of us react the same. We're all carrying different experiences and understandings. We're carrying different responses to trust, to education, to power, to identity. We need to not be scared of making mistakes. And conflict is healthy and a key part of this, but we also need to build up those skills. So part of bridging mutual aid work with anti-oppression work is also leaning into conflict. In British culture, I find that seems like a particular challenge for some people. It's hard, it confronts us, but it's, as Sari just said, it's a driver for change. So if we're not naming the conflict, it doesn't mean the conflict isn't there. When we're not naming the conflict, what it means is that people are having feelings and experiences and not talking about. And what that means is that you can't deal with it. And that breaks down interdependence, it breaks down community, it breaks down trust. And it also means that we start pocketing pieces of power in different places to feel held. So they're the key things to remember there. I feel like I just missed something, so I'm just gonna double check in my notes. If there's something else I was gonna say there. No, I think we're good. Okay. So, well, this was supposed to be animated. I failed. So working with who isn't in your group, moving on to that now. A big thing to remember here is it doesn't only mean thinking about how you get other people to join you. And this is where a lot of mutual aid groups are at the moment. They're saying, we're not represented enough. How do we get more representative? And often when you ask why, this is true of mutual aid groups and all sorts of other groups, when you ask why, the answer is because we should. Because And then people might say things like power, because we want to share the power. Sharing the power doesn't mean people coming to you. Sharing the power means understanding who you are and what power and resources you have, and how they relate and are interdependent with other people. So partnering with other groups is a key way that mutual aid groups can access other people, whether that's different community groups, whether that's faith and cultural groups, whether it's pre-existing social care groups. There will be many, many groups around you, some of who you know about and many of who you don't, organising and doing things already. So reach out and try and find out who else is doing things in your area and join with other groups. The next thing is thinking about what messages you send to people outside your group through the imagery, words, and actions you project. So often the biggest barrier of people joining your group is what they see of your group. And that can be okay. So for example, if you are a faith group, people without faith probably won't want to come and join your faith group. That's okay. If you are a predominantly white middle class mutual aid group, which is a lot of the feedback we've had in the survey, the national survey, that we don't know what to do about it, you're probably projecting that image. It's also okay if you understand who you are and how you can partner with other groups, and how you organize successfully within your community. Another thing to think about is centering people, not politics. This is something that the left really struggle with sometimes, which is that we are ideologically driven to projects like mutual aid, to things like anti-oppressive practice. And in the process of trying to find perfect politics, we forget that there are real people, messy people, at the heart of what we're trying to achieve. Understand that people are the experts in their own experience. Let people speak to their own experience. And bring people in your group on that journey with you. And that moves us on nicely to the last point in this section, which is political versus apolitical organising. So there were different comments in the ways that, in the things people said in this form for this webinar. Some people said, it's supposed to be apolitical and I don't know how to bring my values in. And some people said, the way that we talk about this and do it is so political, it doesn't allow space for people to make mistakes, and then we kick people out. So I think people are having very different experiences around this. Like usual, it's another false binary. But ultimately, if you're wrestling with those questions, your ideology is your guiding star. So your ideology should be absolutely the thing that guides you, that guides your principles, that guides your decisions. But people are the journey and the destination. So coming back to that point, reiterating that point I just made about people over politics, is that sometimes we have to remember that there are material conditions that don't fit our perfect outcomes or our perfect processes. And what we want right now is for people to be healthy, to be alive, to be fed, to have social networks of support, to have medication. And the people at the heart of those things should be the things that are guiding our actions. And letting ourselves, sorry, not guiding our actions, but should be the actions, should be the journey and the destination of the actions, but being absolutely check in with your ideology and check in with, have I gone off piste of what I really believe here? Elaborating what I mean by ideology, yeah. So I don't want to make assumptions about what people's ideologies are, which is why I left it vague. But because people talked about the tension between political and apolitical, I'm assuming my assumption about what some of the things people might mean by that are organising because they want a non-statist, a non-state driven way of supporting people in their communities, or perhaps even full luxury, fully automated communism. It might also be, in terms of anti-oppression, a kind of commitment to, I mean, ideology might be the slightly wrong word for this, but like a commitment to principles of justice and equity might be what I mean by ideology here. But if we try for justness to be the journey, it doesn't recognize the real world that we live in, and the messiness of the way there. This is the last section of me talking, and then we will be at we'll do a little activity, and then we'll be at the Q&A. So just so you know, you don't have to listen to my drony voice for too much longer. And right now I'm going to talk about everything I've just talked about are the kind of principles and key top tips for general organizing. And right now we are not in that world. Or we are in that world, but we're not in that world, if you know what I mean. And so what does this mean for virtual and distance engagement? There are a whole different set of conditions right now that none of us have ever really experienced at this scale. So working with who is in your group. What do all those things that I said mean in practice? You can create systems and support systems for people in your group. Buddies is a good one. So buddies is just a format of pairing people up so that they have an actual individual one-on-one relationship that they can check in with and talk to about things. It creates a sense of interdependence. It creates more meaningful relationships between individual people rather than an individual in a group. Sometimes they can fall down and not really work, and then you can move people around, or you might have to actually lean into conflict and find out why it's not working. But it's a way of creating more of a check-in, more of a kind of way of people feeling cared for on an individualized basis instead of just group to person. It also helps to decentralize power, because it doesn't then have to be that people are constantly checking in with a middle person at the center of a group to understand what's happened or what's going on. That work happens at the peer level. Another thing that one in particular mutual aid group in the example, but some mutual aid groups have done that has been working well, is working with small subgroups of the group to build up competency or confidence before bringing everyone together. So there is a really nice example that came up of somebody who did a lot of work with working with mums as a separate group first, because they felt like they had nothing to offer, and that was coming through in the ways they were joining the group. So they did a lot of work around supporting them and their confidence. And had different groups that they built up before bringing everybody together, or as well as bringing everybody together. Another thing is be social, but also with a caveat, not too much. You don't want to be Bryn from Gavin and Stacey. But in real life, when we're building groups, if we are building a community on our street, what we would be doing is having social space. We'd be having time to bond as humans. And that's really important in anti-oppression practice. A lot of the time when we talk about anti-oppression and principles of anti-oppression, it feels like a drain. It feels like we're talking about ways to tell people off. It feels like things we're scared of getting wrong. But at its heart, anti-oppression work should be joyful. We've talked about shame, and we've talked about the lack of transformation in generating shame, but we rarely talk about the other side of that coin, which is joy. And wholeness, and creating space to be together. It's also true that many of us, a lot of the way that we talk about this stuff is intellectual, but a lot of real change happens when we connect our hearts, and a lot of real change happens when we connect with people and understand different people. In order to do that, coming back full circle to the beginning, we often need to build trust. The way, if you think about your childhood, your teen years, your 20s, before you all became messy, difficult adults. A lot of the ways that you connected with and built relationships was through play, through joy. We start in that place, and then we get into the messy together. And in the political world, for some reason, we seem to skip over that stage and say, we believe in the same thing, now be my friend, and at some point we might play a game together. But it's through that connection to people that we learn that we have our, that we move into discomfort in a natural way, have our views challenged, have new experiences and ideas brought into our world. So create some social space. It could be an online hangout. It could be by doing a periodic go round in the WhatsApp group and asking people to do, it could be tell us something about yourself. It could be one of my favorite current check-in questions in a meeting is if you could describe your brain right now in an adjective you had to use for spaghetti, what would it be? It can be, you know, like, have people just check in with each other in a fun way. You could coordinate, if somebody on your street teaches yoga, you could coordinate an online yoga class, or find ways to build that interdependence through joy. Okay, the next one. Think about how power is distributed in your group and how people are affected differently. I feel like we've talked about that enough, so I'm not going to go into that one again, but if you have questions, we can come back to them. Okay, so working with who is not in your group. One of the most effective strategies that people have been using is translations. So finding ways to translate the materials that you're putting out online and offline into different languages spoken in the local area. Paper-based outreach is what most mutual aid groups are reporting as being the most successful in reaching people most directly affected right now, particularly people shielding, elderly people, people without access for like financial reasons or other reasons to internet, etc. So yes, we're having to do things virtually, but it doesn't mean that we can't use paper. Using the local press, and this is a really big one, and one that I think a lot of the left is out of touch with. It's not because of the internet, we seem to not do this very much anymore. But actually, like, lots of people are still looking at news and information in different ways. Lots of boroughs in the country, towns in the country still have a local newspaper they pop through a door that people read, different kinds of people read. Use it. Some mutual aid groups have reported that local papers wouldn't put adverts for them in. I'm not sure why, I don't have that information. But what they did manage to do is get coverage of the work they're doing. So you can find different ways to try and get in the local press and get your message out there and slip in a way for people to contact you. But it's a really, really useful tool for meeting different people and reaching different people. Working with support services. And I think here, is that this one? Yeah. So I think I separated this out from working with different community groups very specifically, because some of the tensions, coming back to that point about ideology can be your guiding star, but you have to center people, is that some groups have been very, very resistant to working with the council or other local support groups, support services, for very good political reasons. But what that means is the people who need support aren't getting it. That's a really, really profound thing. And so this is one of those moments when we really need to be centering people in our practices and understanding that it might butt up against what we think politically or how we think we should be organizing in this time politically. And that's a compromise that we have to make. And if we know, if we can have dialogue, if we can talk about that and talk it out, we're learning, but we can't have a perfect process. There are lots of community groups who already have lists of, this is their language, not mine, but the council and other community groups have lists of vulnerable people. It's not a word I'd use to describe people, but you know, like, it's the word that they use, and you know what I mean by that. There are already contact lists and ways of reaching people who need support the most right now that your mutual aid group can also additionally support. Does that make sense? Yeah, great. Online, so in Facebook groups in particular, lots of mutual aid groups now, they're in Facebook groups. Think about what you're sharing publicly, both in terms of repping the disproportionate effects of COVID. So use the news to speak for you. It's relevant news to your mutual aid group. People aren't going to be like, why are you posting that in here? Because it's about COVID. But also working collectively to think about unknown consequences of statements. So a lot of the time, the ways that social media breaks down trust very quickly is that somebody writes something that they haven't even thought about being from a particular cultural experience, from a particular identity-based experience, and who it might hurt or exclude in the process. So have a conversation in your group about things that you're putting on social media, and talking through what might the impact of, like, is there anything in this statement that I haven't thought about? How might that sound to this group? Or how might that sound to this group? representing, sorry. So representing the disproportionate effect of COVID. For example, the articles at the beginning about disproportionate deaths and mental health, etc. Okay, so political versus apolitical organising. There's a really good article that I thought, rather than try and reframe, I just give you the headlines from. It's called Mutual Aid Groups, 5 Reflections for Activists Going Local for the First Time. The first point is our street is not an activist group, which speaks to a lot of what I've just talked about. We might do this because we have certain political values, but that's not why people will engage with our mutual aid groups. And that actually gives us an opportunity of a generation politically, because what it means is we can build relationships, build networks, build infrastructure with people who don't share our political backgrounds or experiences or knowledge for real change. Keep our inner charity workers at bay. And that speaks to the point that I said before about if we're trying to lean into conversations in this work by thinking that we have things that other people need to learn with some kind of intellectual or moral superiority, number one, that's already an oppressive behavior. It doesn't lean into the need for our shared learning and understanding. And this shouldn't be about us doing good for others. It should be about interdependence, building our interdependence together. People who join us first are often sorry, I've been talking too long. The people who join us first are often not the most impacted. More local equals less coordination equals greater distribution of power. So more local, by which it means breaking down wards into areas into streets. The more localized that you can make the organizing, the less coordination you need. So if I've broken down into my street, that needs a lot less coordination of 100 people than it would if I'm in my ward, which is, I don't know, hypothetically 5,000. What that means is if I actually broke down my street into houses 10 to 20 into little pockets, you need much less coordination and therefore greater distribution of power, because you don't need people at the top making sure there's coordinated responses. What you can then do is have people who talk to each other in different groups so that you're also then not isolated silos. And they made a really interesting point that we can do more radical food distribution, which keeps more people fed. Here's the link to the article for anybody who wants it. We can do more radical food distribution, which keeps more people fed. And I think this is a really good example of how you can bring your politics into organizing in a way that isn't about posturing your politics or telling people to agree with you. So the example they give is that instead of, which is like, they write it in a way with no judgment, but instead of going to Asda to pick up a bag of groceries for your friend, what your street could do is order in from workers' cooperatives food to distribute across the street. And in that way, it also makes the food cheaper for people, but it means that you're supporting businesses and infrastructure that you want to support politically in the process of doing this work. It slightly contradicts point 4 because it does need a bit more coordination, but hopefully in a way that supports interdependence rather than community, rather than power. So it's a great article for breaking those things down, which you can read. Quick summary before we move on to the Q&A. So these were the problems that were identified in that national survey. Hopefully, I've touched on many of them. Similar demographics of people being the ones to get involved, tech-based methods excluding those most in need, text-based communications allow little room for trust and understanding, how to manage unconscious bias and ignorance, policing, not knowing what to do about any of the above. Remember, what happened there? Remember, this is new for everyone. Don't, like, you're feeling overwhelmed. It's okay that you're feeling overwhelmed. We are in completely untrodden territory here. It's new for everyone. Even those of us who've done remote organizing for a long time have never been in this environment. Don't let perfection be the enemy of good. Mistakes are part of the process. Don't fear them. we started off by saying what is anti-oppression, and we talked about it as a practice, as a doing. In doing, we will make mistakes. That is part of the process. You will cause harm to yourself, you will cause harm to other people will cause harm to you. That is part of being alive. Anti-oppression is working through that. It's understanding the power, it's understanding interdependence, and it's understanding the trust in that equation. And the key here for this moment and this time is we need to be sharing stories of trial, error, and success more. We need to be coming to each other and having these conversations and talking more. And it's only in that sharing and that talking that we will really get through this.